Xtalks is the industry leader in connecting life science, food, healthcare, and medical device professionals. The Xtalks Life Science podcast features insightful conversations with industry experts about all things pharma, biotech, and more.
Hello and welcome to the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. I'm Ayesha Rashid, Senior Life Science Journalist at Xtalks.com. And this week, I'm delighted to introduce not one, but two very special guests on the show. We have with us today Sarah Averill Lott, who is a program lead at Digital Medicine Society, or DIME, as well as Dr. Diane Stephenson, who is the Vice President of Neurology at the Critical Path Institute, or CPAth. The Digital Medicine Society is a global nonprofit and a professional home for digital medicine. The organization drives the broad adoption of digital approaches to advance the practice of medicine to enhance public health. DIME convened a working group to identify barriers to greater utilization of digital measures in Alzheimer's research and subsequently developed resources to help researchers and clinicians to more quickly adopt digital measures in a field that has been lagging behind other therapeutic areas and disease areas. The Critical Path Institute leads collaborations that accelerate drug development, advancing better treatments for people worldwide. Sarah Averill Lott is, as I mentioned, a program lead at DIME, the Digital Medicine Society, once again, and where she supports programs and resources that promote the safe, effective, and equitable use of digital health technologies to advance clinical research and improve outcomes for patients. She has degrees in neuroscience as well as public health. Dr. Diane Stephenson is a neuroscientist by training with 35 years of combined experience in academic neuroscience and drug discovery. Dr. Stephenson joined Critical Path Institute in 2011 and presently leads the neurology programs centered around Critical Path for Parkinson's and Critical Path for Alzheimer's disease. Dr. Stephenson received her PhD in medical neurobiology from Indiana University. She spent the majority of her career as a translational neuroscientist at the largest pharmaceutical companies focusing on disease areas including Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS, and autism spectrum disorders. To hear more about the work at Digital Medicine Society and the collaborations between the Digital Medicine Society and CPAth, let's turn to Sarah and Dr. Stephenson now. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
We appreciate your kind introductions.
Oh, thank you. It was a pleasure, absolute pleasure, and a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation and learning more about what the two organizations do in terms of really advancing care for patients ultimately, and how the collaboration between the two organizations came about. And so I'd love to learn more about that. But stepping back a bit, I'd like to actually learn a bit more about your backgrounds. Perhaps we can start with you, Sarah, and what led you to DIME and really what your role entails in advancing the work that you do there.
Great. Thanks for the opportunity. As far as what led me to DIME, I'd been in the research space in neuropsychology and in neuroscience adjacent things for a long time, but went back to school to get a master's in public health pre-COVID and realized that I wanted to work in a space where people were working to do systemic change, where we were using the technologies and things we have available to us today to truly solve some of the biggest problems in medicine and healthcare. That led me to DIME. I couldn't be happier to be there. And like you said, I really do work to help develop the programs and resources that people then use when they're looking to adopt or implement digital health technologies in clinical trials. We work to make that process more frictionless, more effective, more ethical, and ultimately to make sure we can serve patients better. So that's a little bit about what I do.
Wonderful. And Dr. Stephenson at CPAth, really how is the Institute really addressing the unmet needs and really the critical areas that need to be addressed within neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's and like Parkinson's?
Yes, thank you so much for that question. I'm so fortunate to be at Critical Path Institute. It's a nonprofit organization that's aimed to improve and streamline drug development. We received generous funding from the FDA to do what they really cannot do on their own, because each sponsor that comes to them with a potential new therapy for patients has to struggle with what are those tools that is going to help us identify the right patient and the right drug at the right time. So, in leading our efforts, our first disease area that we embarked on many years ago at CPATH was actually Alzheimer's disease. And we were one of the first to bring together clinical trials, many of which failed for Alzheimer's disease, and bring that data and learn how we can help learn from those studies and make future studies even more improved with innovative tools. In the past, we used traditional type of biomarkers and modeling tools and endpoints, but with the evolution in the digital science arena and digital health technologies, particularly in COVID, we saw there was a huge opportunity, and it's been so rewarding to partner in synergies with Dime to see how we can work together across this complex and rapidly evolving ecosystem.
That's wonderful. And so, my next question to the both of you is can you discuss really how the collaborative process between Dime and Critical Path Institute came about, and how each organization is supporting advancements in the Alzheimer's disease and related disorders initiative?
Diane, do you want to take that first bit about just how you're collaborating? And then I'd love to jump into some of the specific things at Dime that we've done recently.
Yes. Actually, the true partnership that we started with Dime at CPATH was in the area of Parkinson's disease. Many of you may not know that in Parkinson's disease, over time, many of the patients experience devastating cognitive dysfunction that progresses over time. And it's becoming more and more clear now that these disorders that traditionally were thought to be very different have very common features, including the underlying pathology of the disease. So we embarked on a project that really was catalyzed by our partners at the Michael J. Fox Foundation, who saw that there were huge gaps in the area of digital technologies, just trying to understand the complexity of the landscape. There's tremendous number of studies in Parkinson's digital landscape, and we were so fortunate to connect with Jen Goldsack and the entire Dime team and Sarah to ask, how can we leverage the incredibly impressive crowdsourcing endpoint library that the Dime hosts across many diseases to make a very focused inventory only on Parkinson's. We've learned so much in the very short time since this project has started, and that's really what got us enthusiastic about now what we've done this in Parkinson's and learned from Sarah and her team how we apply this approach to Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just follow up and say that as Dan indicated, we ran this project for aggregating digital health technologies and how they're being used in populations with Parkinson's. And Dime was running at the same time the Alzheimer's and related dementias project. And so while these were scoped as two discrete projects, there's a lot of overlap in the populations and the types of things that are being evaluated. And we've produced resources now in both of those spaces. And one of the reasons that we wanted to talk about them both today is because of those commonalities that we have. When we say Alzheimer's and related dementias and Parkinson's, we're actually talking about a lot of overlap and a lot of potential opportunities for digital health to really accelerate research to help us find those therapeutics, because these are areas where so much good work is happening, so much good work has been done, and yet we're not at the place where we can say we've cured or in remission, or those words we would love to hear over the next few years for any of these dementias and for the patients and people who love them that are living with this. So we have a library of digital measurement products that captures, like I said, the uses, digital health technologies, as reported in the peer-reviewed literature, assessing Parkinson's patients, and then across a range of dementia populations where we have all severities of Alzheimer's disease, mild cognitive impairment, frontotemporal dementias, Lewy body dementias, and so on. It's quite comprehensive, and this is a resource that we know folks are using as they're looking at, hey, how can I use these technologies when we're designing studies, or how can they be used? As part of the Alzheimer's project, we developed actually a lot of additional resources as well that, if I could just say a few words about that, we wanted to ascertain what was meaningful to patients who are living with dementia and to their care providers and to the clinicians who care for them. And so a few years ago when Dime sort of undertook this initiative, it was a pre-competitive collaborative project in true Dime fashion. We had technology developers, and we had pharmaceutical representative companies, and we had caregivers, advocates, patients. And we decided we needed to go to not only assess the qualitative literature, but then also do a global survey so that we really could make sure that we were being representative when we looked at what is meaningful. What are people experiencing when they are living with dementia? What are the true impacts? There's so much good work that happens when a clinician evaluates somebody, and then there's what's happening every day in their daily life while they're at home over time and how that's changing what they're experiencing. So we did a global survey and ended up with 1,000 responses from patients, care partners, and healthcare providers. From that data, a lot of analysis was done on that, which was then presented to experts in this field, who then distilled it down to, of these things that are meaningful to patients, what can we measure with the technologies that are mature and ready today, and why should we measure them? And then we developed a suite of resources that launched in November to help folks do that in clinical research. So Diane's been a great champion of the work we're doing in that space, and one of the best advocates I know for digital health in the Alzheimer's population, and then directly collaborated with us, like we said, on that Parkinson's library. And I really do see these as part of a combined ecosystem where we're trying to move this research forward.
Yes, I want to add on to that, especially why now, right? So again, as I said, Alzheimer's and Parkinson's have been tackling trials, but the failure rate of clinical trials in these two disorders is astonishing. It's the highest in most all disorders. It's the highest failure rate. And the reason why these fields are coming together and why this is such an exciting time to join forces is around how we think about the earlier we intervene, the better. And we need to intervene as best as possible, of probably more than the 45 therapeutic targets I used to work on in industry. I'm convinced that many of them would have worked if we would have gone early in the disease. So, as many people really want what their dream we'd call a digital endpoint, we're seeing, especially from the regulators, huge interest in using these digital tools to identify at-risk individuals very, very early in the disease course, where they might not be showing symptoms enough to be fully ready for a true clinical diagnosis, but they know something's wrong, right? So those are two things in common. In Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, we hear often from patients they knew something was wrong far before they ever got a true diagnosis. So finding patients. But the other amazing thing that's happening that's uniting Alzheimer's and Parkinson's are related disorders such as Lewy body dementia, a frontotemporal dementia. These have cognitive impairments that could be assessed with reliable sensitive tools that are digital based in the home. Yet, really, each disease has kind of been tackling it on our own, right? So I think there's huge opportunities because the pipeline for these two disorders is very rich. There's tremendous insights of new developments, especially into understanding of the underlying pathophysiology of the disease and targets that really promise to be disease modifying. But if we don't know how to identify the right patients early in the disease and see how to assess them in their own real world settings at home, we're not going to be able to have the ability to test if these promising drugs are truly safe and effective in people with this suffering from these devastating disorders.
Yeah, that's tremendous. And we, hear about the importance of early detection in almost every disease area. And definitely that's been lagging behind in this space in particular. And so I'd like to know what the key kind of barriers have been in preventing the greater use or adoption of digital measures in Alzheimer's research as a whole.
I'm happy to start with just a perception. I mean, I'll just want to say a personal note that sadly I lost both my mother and my brother to dementias, and I saw that they struggled so much with their disorder without a recognition from others about how much they were struggling, right? And so the barriers to them were things like how do they get to the physician? How do they get to the center? How do they get seen by an expert? And it's so eye-opening to me that when I read papers and I meet researchers, even those that are champions of digital health, they'll come up with all the problems, right? We don't have enough adherence, or this patient wasn't compliant, or there were too much missing data, or there's too many problems because aged people don't know how to use technology, or they'll come up with 20 different problems, right? But if we don't try to solve those problems together, we're really not serving what the patients truly need. And the physicians don't have the bandwidth now to see patients like they used to, right? These are 5-minute visits and they can't even keep up with their own workload. So I would say that let's get all the problems out on the table. We've heard them and over again. The last frustrating thing that I'll say to you is that there's a true, absolute misperception of the role of the FDA. The FDA is doing an incredible job of promoting innovation. They've established an absolutely new center of excellence that's cross centers and cross divisions where they all work together on trying to tackle problems in digital health, AI, problems with analyzing complex data in ways that's really helping drive people that are researchers and especially clinical trialists that are bringing them this kind of complex data. So they're all in, they're part of the ecosystem, they're part of the answers. And so I'm just sharing with you that both on a personal level, as a scientific level, and a champion for this, I think we need to really look at the barriers and understand that we can solve them. And a lot of them are already being solved. Right. And we should not talk ourselves out of the potential here because it's so important to patients, especially.
Absolutely. And their families and caregivers and communities. And so, Dr. Stephenson, thank you so much for sharing, again, both that personal perspective along with the scientific and the professional. It's so important to really keep, I think, the context there. And it's not just one context in many cases, right? So thank you so much for that. Sarah, what's your take on sort of the barriers? And as Dr. Stephenson said, we may be identifying, the field may be identifying what those challenges are and barriers are, but how do you really come in as an organization, as what you're doing, and how do you take on those challenges and to really break those barriers, and how do you encourage the adoption of digital medicine and digital tools in this space?
Yeah, there's a lot there that you just alluded to, but let me just first say, completely appreciate everything that Diane just shared. And also I'll add, these are complex disorders with complex etiologies. There's a reason that this has sort of been so hard to move the needle on. And in part because of the complexity of them. And the difficulty of reaching, Dan alluded, how do you get somebody to the clinic when you're dealing with somebody's cognitive impairment, and the very real burden that is. And then there's the fact that while the hallmark is cognitive impairment or cognitive incline, there's all these other systemic impacts that show up often with dementia. There can be things like physical activity or eating or sleep impacts. There's all these downstream effects. Where do you start looking? Where do you start measuring? Where do you look for the signal over noise? There's the validity. Do we have the right validity? Have we assessed these things in the populations that are truly representative? Have we tested the usability? There's a perception sometimes that bringing in digital health technology is going to be burdensome to the patient. There is the very real bandwidth that Dr. Stephenson alluded to with clinician burden, asking them to incorporate one more thing or use that. These are things that are being talked about. We are seeing an increase, for example, in this space in ambient technologies that are sensing things in the environment without asking somebody to wear it on their person, that it can be a wall-mounted sensor or ballistocardiography sensors embedded in a mattress, things like that can pick up daily movement and patterns in ways that aren't asking too much of a patient. So I think the biggest thing is just, are we looking at the right things? We now have the opportunity to actually assess people in their homes in real life over time. And we have the opportunity to democratize access to the clinical research through digital health technologies that we could not do realistically before. By being able to do, decentralized clinical trials, putting technologies in people's homes, it's now you no longer have to be within physical proximity to a clinical trial necessarily. And then bringing the right people to the table to share what are the barriers they're seeing, get it all out there, like Dr. Stephenson said, and start saying, this is what we're seeing is working. This is where we've had success. These are where we're running into limitations, and engaging with regulatory, which is something that both of our organizations have really prioritized, is bringing that voice in to the conversation as well, because you want to be set up for success when you are engaging with the FDA, and they are championing it and they want to have those conversations. So we can talk about any of those aspects in depth, but that's the overview. Is let's use these technologies the right way, in a patient-centric way, but in an intentional and thoughtful way, so that we're getting the right signals. Easier said than done, but we are actually making significant progress there, I think.
That's wonderful to hear. And so, In terms of using digital measures in clinical trials, in diagnosis, and all of these various aspects of the patient journey, essentially, or the disease journey, I know that DIME actually emphasizes that digital tools are not a cure-all. And so, Sarah, can you elaborate on how you determine when digital solutions are appropriate and effective in clinical research?
Yeah, absolutely. They are tools. A tool is only as good as the context and situation that you're using it in. And you can use it correctly, or you can capture a bunch of noise that ends up meaning nothing, and then it just adds overhead and burden to a trial. So we, of course, are enormous advocates for the very real power that a DHT can bring to a trial, digital health technology. But they have to be used in a fit for purpose way. You need the right validity. And, at DIME, we have the V3 Plus framework. Dr. Jesse Backer did a great job expanding that this past year, that has had enormous uptake, where you have to have the right technical verification, analytical validation, clinical validation, and now, importantly, usability validation, which goes far beyond actually like a feasibility type study, to really make sure you are assessing the use of this technology in the patients that you're working with in a way that you are determining it is not going to be burdensome for them or the people who are responsible for deploying it, or whatever the case may be. So first of all, do you have the right validity so that you know you are selecting the right tool for the right setting? Are you sampling a representative population? Are you meeting an unmet measurement need? That's important. Or are you meeting a measurement need that represents something that is meaningful to patients? We can measure all sorts of things out there, but what you increasingly hear, especially like from regulators, is it meaningful? Is it capturing something that is clinically relevant and reflects the patient's experience? And again, digital health technologies are actually uniquely suited in a lot of ways to capture that, because you get that real world continuous data in people's homes outside the clinic, where somebody at the clinic might be able to turn something on enough to get through a task or an appointment, and then they go home and how are they really doing? Capturing what's meaningful. So when you can kind of put those pieces together, you know you're in a good place. And DIME, of course, has hundreds of open access free resources that are designed to help you kind of evaluate and set yourself up for success with it. But yeah, it is using a fit for purpose tool in the right setting responsibly, protecting patients' data and privacy, using AI tools responsibly. There's so many components that go into this, but it can be done well, and it should be done well.
I'm happy to share the example of how we've done this in our Critical Path Institute Parkinson's project that we would love to apply for Alzheimer's as well. So we started on this journey some time back. At Critical Path Institute, what FDA funds us to do is to bring together data from trials. When we started this project, we had a couple of companies that were going to partner together to do something that had not been done, try to assess digital technologies that look at both motor and non-motor symptoms in people at their very first time of diagnosis. The study was led by Jamie Adams and Ray Dorsey and Jennifer Mayman at University of Rochester, but we came on board as on behalf of a consortium, and we included FDA very early upfront and the EMA before the study started. This was before COVID, and we got their input on the design itself. And they didn't say, looks great, go ahead. They said, wait a minute, make sure you have controls and make sure you talk to the patients. And how do you understand the meaningfulness of all these measures you're looking at? So this whole project has been refined over time under the advice of regulators, which is very different. The other unique thing about the study is we shared all the data in real time. So everybody that was part of the project, 6 companies, all the different nonprofits and everything, got access to the data. But more importantly, we actually shared the results with the research participants themselves. So it was not a clinical trial, but it's absolutely astonishing to see how much it helped patients to see what their data was of these personal symptom maps. How were they not even realizing that some aspects of the disease were part of Parkinson's? It wasn't just that they were having a bad day or that they were having problems with sleep or other non-motor symptoms. So by learning together, and we've now had, I think, 6 publications on this, what's called the Watch PD study. And some of these publications are co-authored with both FDA and people living with Parkinson's. So it's a really great case example, because unfortunately, most of the time, when sponsors and companies use digital tools in their trials as exploratory tools, we don't really learn from those. They're done as individual sponsors, and we're not learning together. So my dream is that the DIME crowdsourcing library goes from where we are, which is this incredible resource of what's in the published literature, but now starts including these exploratory measures that the FDA really wants to learn from as well. So it's a long story, but we're really excited about where we are. And I feel like no matter what disease, we can take on Alzheimer's and other related brain disorders because we need to learn together. These are such complex diseases, is what Sarah said.
Thank you so much for highlighting that. And that's such an important aspect when we talk about who are the different stakeholders in clinical research, and to really include patients as a key stakeholder in that equation. I think that's so critical and so important. Thank you so much for sharing that. And in terms of speaking about different stakeholders, Dr. Stephenson, can you share some examples of how you did speak about the FDA, and but what about public-private partnerships? I know that you've spent a good number of years in the pharmaceutical industry, and in terms of the industry side of things, and then you have the academic side of things, academia, and then nonprofit organizations. Of course, the CPATH that you're at now. And so how do you see, or what are some examples of public-private partnerships that have really accelerated the development of therapies for Parkinson's, and how can those lessons be applied to Alzheimer's research?
Yeah, it's so timely for you to ask me that question. I've been so fortunate to lead this critical path for Parkinson's since we launched 10 years ago. But before that, again, I was working on public-private partnerships for Alzheimer's as well. So I've seen this ecosystem change in such dramatic ways. You know, when I was in industry, I remember going to conferences like Society for Neuroscience, and we had to turn our badge around when we went to talk to someone at a poster at a competing company because we weren't even allowed to talk to them. But now it's just astonishing, right? With thanks to initiatives like ADNI and PPMI and data sharing, we're seeing these tools come forward in ways that would have taken any one company probably 30 years, right? And so I'm just absolutely astonished to see the progress, especially over the last couple of years, with things like biologic staging and now having biomarkers and tools that allow us to identify at-risk individuals with their underlying biology that you can measure to know who can go into trials with promising candidates that are preventative in nature. This could not be done by a single organization or a company or a single nonprofit or anything. And then I look at the parallel progress of DIME and how we've been on these trajectories. And I remember when we met all those years ago and at conferences, and people thought, you're not going to be able to bring all these groups together and share data. But it is really happening. I would say my only, frustration or call to action is if we could be more open about sharing. So for some reason, data sharing in the digital technology space is harder than any other kind of data sharing we've ever had to deal with at CPATH. Probably tied up in technologies and IP and those kind of confidentiality types of things that they sign when they do legal agreements with tech providers. But if we could really open up the umbrella, and this is where the crowdsourcing library, I think, is all just poised, ready to go, and be more open around not just what works, but what doesn't work. Where are the failures? How are we going to learn together? I think this transformation is just ready to go, right? There's new initiatives, there's the regulatory landscape of innovation. We just need to share data easier and faster than it's taking now. Lastly, I'll say we have a new paper that just came out a few months ago, led by our industry partners at Novartis and all this different stakeholders. I think we have 45 authors in this paper on using federated learning approaches, right? Rather than waiting and sharing this really cumbersome data of how to download data from digital tools, if we can have a consensus methodology that could be employed using novel AI approaches in-house with individual sponsor companies and researchers, we can be primed and ready to go. So long answer, but I think we're at a really exciting time.
Indeed. I think what I'm hearing is really building in operational efficiencies, which we hear a lot about, but like to hear this playing into action and to see how that's really coming about practically. That's in the application of what that really means. I think you've covered it so well. So thank you for that. And really great to hear that really you're having these kinds of partnerships. And and they're very fruitful, and again, efficiency and all of those things built into that. And so I'd also like to ask Sarah, in terms of the adoption of digital tools in healthcare and research, there are questions around ethics and how people can have equitable access in terms of also being accessible to underrepresented populations and such. And so how does DIME ensure that the adoption of these digital tools is accessible really to all of those different populations and areas?
Well, in part by making it embodied into our core mission statement and ensuring that every resource we design or group that we bring to the table, that is part of the conversation. And that is not just lip service, but are we actually reaching folks that we haven't been reaching before? Culture, race, gender, we have a lot of different populations that are experiencing common things and also might be interpreting those differently or have different things they value in that space. So for example, when we were doing our global survey of folks experiencing dementia and their care partners and healthcare providers, we knew that, for example, losing independence commonly comes up as something that's important to you. And in the United States, it might be, I'm worried I can't drive anymore, or that I'm going to have my keys taken away. There might be urban areas or other countries where that's not the first thing people are saying, because sometimes the words you're saying are representing, they're not saying I'm worried about losing my independence. They might, or they might say I'm worried about keys or some other aspect, and you're connecting those dots. So just understanding the nuances of the people you're working with. And again, we can do that now much more effectively than we could before. We can reach folks in different communities. We can make sure we're having more representative groups. We have lots of resources I can think of off the top of my head at DIME that are designed to help you make sure, am I thinking of these different components and am I using that data responsibly? So just ensuring that it's part of the conversation and that we are then sharing that data back and making these things open access so that everyone can learn from them.
And that's really wonderful to hear, because I think really having the access is key, right from the clinical research stage through to treatments and the actual tools that patients can benefit from. And in terms of delivering treatments at the early stages of Parkinson's, which CPATH focuses on, Dr. Stephenson, how might similar approaches really improve the trajectory of Alzheimer's disease treatment?
Right. I mean, this is such a great example of how these two fields have been just pioneering new ways to look at prevention, right? And I think there are studies already underway that 3 to 5 years ago, we would say we were never even ready at all. I would say I would view digital tools as one of many potential tools that are being used to identify at-risk individuals on a large scale and then use a triage pyramid type of scheme, right? To identify people and then bring them in for more comprehensive assessments that give you that snapshot of what is their biology, what is their underlying biology that's going to tell you this precision medicine therapy that, again, was not even dreamed of just a few years ago. And there's initiatives that are already underway, and prevention trials are actually further along in Alzheimer's right now than they have been in Parkinson's disease. But novel, innovative strategies that are being recommended by the FDA, multi-arm trial designs and platform trials are being used where there's a shared placebo arm. These studies are already happening, right? And again, I think these tools are just emerging at a time where we're going to be well poised to use them, and we just need to inspire people with living with the disease to be enrolling in these studies, research studies as well as trials, to make sure that we have the number of participants ready to go. And probably not well recognized enough that people that enroll in research participation actually do better in terms of their overall quality of life.
And in terms of when we talk about digital tools, really looking at what the patient is going to engage with, things like emerging technologies like AI, wearables, real world data that's coming from these tools. So how do you see these technologies really reshaping patient outcomes for those living with neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's?
I could start, or you start, Sarah, and then I can jump with a case example.
Okay, so I was just going to say, I think just the fact that we're going to get that more representative real world data, all of which can help lead to better signals for that earlier intervention, earlier diagnosis, or better management as we better understand the disease trajectory and as we start to connect the dots on how some of these diseases that we, again, have traditionally siloed, but we are seeing have so many commonalities. It's just really exciting to think that that is going to not only help us better understand where to intervene and how to intervene, but then detecting response to treatment earlier and more effectively. And then I think Diane kind of alluded to this, but I see it as a chance to empower patients. You just mentioned better quality of life when you're in a trial. Maybe you you know how you're feeling, but you're having a hard time articulating that, or you go to a doctor and you're not able to fully describe it. To have it sort of validated and captured for you and say, like, as Diane said, this is part of the disease process. I am experiencing this. It's not just in my head. There is something, going on here. And, or allowing patients to be able to ask for support or intervention where they need it, or just to understand that better what they are experiencing. That patient empowerment piece is huge. And it's something that we can really think about when we are deploying these technologies, when we're using them in the clinical research setting, letting patients, have access to the data in a way that makes sense to them and is useful to them and isn't just overwhelming them. It all needs to be done responsibly, but I think that that's really impactful, and I hope will help incentivize that patient participation. I think it's really exciting, and I think we will see that it does lead to those better insights that we want.
Yeah, I could not agree more. And it's amazing to see now so much recognition about non-pharmacologic things that people can do in their daily lives that don't take going in a trial, but it's really helping them with their quality of life, lifestyle changes, right? But I will say, probably one of the examples we have at CPATH, it's not that well known, especially for people that study the nervous system, is what we've done in type 1 diabetes. So we were able to bring in data from many different observational studies and trials to look at the trajectory of at-risk individuals. What are those biomarkers that happen prior to onset of symptoms? In the area of type 1 diabetes, it's pretty phenomenal to see that we've been able to put all this data together, bring the data to the regulators, and now have models of disease progression. But what came out of this was November of 2022 was the first drug for prevention of type 1 diabetes. In the world of digital health technologies in diabetes, as you know, continuous glucose monitoring has been around a lot, and it's been used in the clinic over and over and over again, more so than in trials. So there you have a situation where patients are using it all the time. And of course, it makes sense to use in trials. But what's so exciting is that by having CPATH and our alliance with all the stakeholders and the FDA and EMA, we were able to help contribute to this first ever prevention for type 1 diabetes. And I feel like that approach and the use of the digital tools are really going to be seminal in helping us get there for brain disorders as well.
Wonderful. Yeah. To really translate from one disease area, the lessons and learnings, and to apply them in another disease area, I think that's great. I think there are so many learnings that are transferable. So, indeed. And so, in terms of metrics, does DIME use, what specific metrics does DIME use to assess the success of initiatives like this working group on Alzheimer's disease?
So I'll just say, of course, we have a lot of different internal things we track with uptake and use and where we see things show up in the ecosystem. But honestly, our favorite way is when folks tell us, and we collect those resources and share them on our website and on our socials. I think it was just 3 weeks ago that Cambridge Cognition, who's doing a lot of great work in this space, shared how their platforms can be used to assess these core measures that we defined through the ADRD project. And we've had clinical teams reach out and saying that they are using our library when they're looking at, as part of their evidence, an informed strategy for DHT selection in the clinical trial space. So we know that people are using these resources, and we find that really gratifying, and are always grateful when folks feel like that this is something that is helping make that a little bit easier for them. But of course, we'll be ultimately watching for that increased uptake of things like digital endpoints in the registered protocols that we track at clinicaltrials.gov and places like that. And then ultimately watching for how therapeutics are being derived and how those are emerging and leading to better outcomes for patients. But so we're doing everything we can to facilitate that. But it's really just a lot of those conversations, and then watching those different signals as they pop up in different places as we work with folks.
And for stakeholders across industry, academia, regulatory bodies, what steps would the both of you recommend to really accelerate the adoption of digital tools in Alzheimer's and related disorders research?
So
Maybe
yeah.
I'll just tell you when we just had an incredible success that was broke all records. So I'll tell you what it took to get there. But the FDA just issued to us what's called a letter of support for a biomarker. It's a biomarker of synuclein that's measured in cerebral spinal fluid in human CSF. And the time it took to issue the letter of support was only 3 months from the date we submitted the data to the FDA. And it was not a digital biomarker, right, or a digital tool, but the way we got there was just so important to learn from, because there were a number of things that happened. There were multiple, 5 different geographic observational studies and 2 clinical trials that contributed to the evidence that we provided to the FDA. But most important, everybody utilized the very similar, almost identical biomarker assay. And if we could get there in digitals, the problem with digitals now is it's the Wild West. There's too many different approaches, too many different platforms, too many different approaches. And so my dream would be, if we want to really make progress a lot faster, if we could try to align on standards to collect particular sets of assessments in a certain way, then down the road in 2 to 3 years, we're going to have this data be all aligned. But right now, the big problem is we don't have a good way to have interoperability of data for digitals across different platforms. It's like putting together Humpty Dumpty. You can't easily do it. So my dream is that this is actually what came out of the DIME library for us for Parkinson's, is a standardized paper for gait measurements. We need that for cognition. We need to have some way to say, okay, here's where the field is. Here's where the measures that we need to look at for early cognitive assessments. How do we get aligned on a more consensus plan so everybody isn't doing their own thing? But that's just my approach, my dream, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, Sarah.
Yeah, well, first of all, interoperability was right at the top of my list as well. When we develop our core measure sets across different therapeutic areas, one of the things we do add to our resources are suggestions on what that data reporting and collection can look like. And then we're partnering with folks like CDISC, which is doing a great job with data standards, terminology standardization, data reporting sets, sample data sets. So we 100% agree, like Diana's spot on here, that to really get maximum insights, we need to be sharing data, and that data, we need to be able to interpret that data across multiple findings, and we just have to get better there. I will say that I had an interesting conversation recently with somebody who was in the digital health technology development space, where she said, because DIME and Critical Path Institute do such a good job at bringing together these different stakeholders, but a lot of times they're competitors, right? Different companies, developer companies, pharmaceutical companies. And what this individual said to me is, she said, I'm starting to realize that the enemy isn't, I'm not competing with other digital health technology developers. The enemy isn't, that's not the enemy. The enemy is no digital at all. Like, we need to be working together and share the real findings here so that we can say these really will lead to improved patient lives. And we have to work together to do that. We have to share data. And so I appreciated Dr. Stephenson calling that out, that there has been some reluctance here. And again, we get it, but it's not unsolvable. And I think, so just to drive adoption, I mean, that's our bread and butter here at DIME, driving the adoption of these things. And we have, please use our resources. They are free and open access. They're designed to help you. You know, sometimes the hardest challenge is making the case internally to an internal team that this is the right thing to do. And we can help you know who to bring to the table internally, to have the digital team, but also the right measures people, the right qualitative people, so that you can make that case internally. We can help you build the case that there is a return on the investment when maybe there's that risk aversion within your company. And we are actually building right now a how-to guide or roadmap for digital health technology developers and adopters to better understand how they can use these technologies in a way that brings that return that they are looking for, that better serves patients, and it sets them up for success with FDA and other regulatory bodies. These are all really critical components, and we are doing everything we can to bring those together into a very streamlined way. There are a lot of moving pieces here, but they can actually be distilled and organized in a way where you feel like, okay, I know what I need to do next. I know what rationale I need to bring to the table. I know how to use these responsibly and ethically. I know how to take that data and turn it into something meaningful when we're done, et cetera, and so on. So for driving adoption, we need to be working together. We need to be sharing the wins and the success stories. That's how we all learn, including FDA, by the way, which helps all of us. So, focusing on that clear fit for purpose data collection that centers on patients and is responsible, and we will see those successes. We will.
And what's your vision? I know that both of you did kind of allude to sort of what the vision is moving forward for the adoption of digital tools and really evolving the space. And both the both of you and your organizations are really at the helm of driving this forward. So really incredible work that's happening both at DIME and CPATH. And so what is really the vision for how digital medicine and collaborative consortia like CPATH and DIME can transform research and care in Alzheimer's and Parkinson's over the next few years or the next decade?
Diane?
Yeah, so because we've learned so much from this Watch PD study, and it's hard to take other data and pull it all together into a single unified database. I would love to see this happen again for Alzheimer's and related dementias, that they tackle it together. In fact, I think just last week I saw an RFA go out on behalf of Cure PSP, Alzheimer's Association, Michael J. Fox Foundation on how to support studies on sleep across those disorders, PSP, AD, PD, and even Lewy body dementia. How do we do this together? So for me, we learned so much from one study. It wasn't even that many patients, right? But we need to learn together, and we need to go all in to share funding and share data. And it's so rare. There's so much challenges to getting people to be open and sharing everything. But I would say the FDA really wants us to do this because they're going to learn with us. And the patients are going to benefit faster. So that's my dream or call to action I'd love to see happen.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, we are all looking for something that really, really transforms the therapeutics we have available, that really gives us a chance to intervene in the disease trajectory. But even in the meantime, what I'm really excited about is our chance to really address dementia care holistically. Like the DIME core measures that we developed based on that patient and expert feedback focus not only on memory, which is of course critical and will always be a component of that assessment, but word finding, sedentary or non-sedentary physical activity, and sleep. And it was so interesting as we built the rationale for each of those, we considered how a patient actually felt and operated in their day-to-day. How did it affect the people that are caring for them? That's huge. When somebody isn't sleeping well, their care partner isn't sleeping well as well. And there's, we're getting a better sense of, we need to be considering the holistic experience of the patient and considering all those aspects when we're looking at building treatment plans, when we're looking at how to make somebody's life better. My hope is that we see that translate both into the research space to therapeutics that allow us to get to not only the core etiology, which we need to solve, but some of those broader impacts. And then also that we can better care for folks because we better understand what they're experiencing and we're better able to meet them where they are and support them. That is really encouraging to me, and I'm excited to see how that plays out moving forward.
Well, Sarah and Dr. Stephenson, I'd like to thank you so much for, firstly, the work that you're leading in the field, really in the adoption of digital tools, and really highlighting not only their importance, but in terms of on the research side, but really how that impacts patients in the whole disease journey. So thank you so much for the work that you do. And thank you so much for having this conversation with me here at Xtalks. We really, really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. What a very engaging conversation. We really appreciate your role in leading this team.
Yes, thank you. And I can't thank Diane also for supporting here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so, so much. All right, that's the end of this episode of the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. If you liked today's show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Thank you, everyone, and we will see you next time. Bye for now.
To join the Xtalks community, visit xtalks.com and register for exclusive access to curated content like live webinars, news articles, and educational videos. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speakers sharing them and should not be taken as professional advice, nor do they necessarily reflect the policy or position of Honeycomb Worldwide. For further information, email us at podcast@xtalks.com.